Okay, I think we can probably get started here. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Braden McNeil. I'm the Technical Sales and Marketing Lead here at Aquanty. We're, of course, the developers of HydroGeoSphere, which is one of the modeling platforms used in the research project that Dr. Andrea Brookfield will be speaking about today. If anybody ever has any questions about HydroGeoSphere and you think you may want to use it for your own research, of course, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Just a quick reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, and so if you need to leave early or anything like that, that's not a problem. You'll be able to find the recording on our YouTube channel. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll have plenty of time to take questions towards the end of the presentation. Should be a relatively short presentation here today, and it's being delivered by Dr. Andrea Brookfield. Andrea, thank you in advance for this great presentation, which I had the pleasure of seeing early at the GACMAC IAH conference in Ottawa this May. I'll just do a brief introduction to Andrea before I hand the mic over to her for the presentation. So Andrea Brookfield is an associate professor in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department at the University of Waterloo. Before this, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science at the University of Kansas and an assistant scientist with the Kansas Geological Survey. Andrea's research interests include the development and use of efficient yet effective numerical tools for water resources management. Primarily, she studies the use of hydrological models to stimulate flow and contaminant transport, including the thermal regime for prediction, management, and process investigation. Andrea, again, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you, Braden. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So to begin with, the presentation I'm going to give today, as Braden mentioned, I gave at the GACMAC IH conference in Ottawa. This work is a product of a master's thesis done by Adam Calvert, who I notice is in the audience here, which is great. So if anyone has questions, I can just punt them his way. So Adam is currently with Montrose Environmental, formerly Matrix, and this work was done in conjunction with our industry partner, who's Blumetric, represented by Ali, who is now at BBA. So just on that note, let me get my slides working for me here. I want to first off acknowledge the funding that we got for this work. So this was funded through a MyTax grant with the partnership with Blumetric. In addition, it was supplemented through my NSERC discovery. And of course, this work couldn't have been done without the licensing and support from Aquanty. So I appreciate their support and appreciate the chance to come and chat with everyone today about Adam's work. So the motivation behind this work is really quite intuitive. If you think about underground workings, whether it is galleries like we have shown here or open pit mines, it's really hard to do this work if you don't dewater. If the groundwater level is so high that it's in the area that you want to work, you have to remove that water, right? This is what needs to happen. And so when planning for this ahead of time, typically what mining companies have been using for, again, their planning and also for their licensing is groundwater only models. Sort of the standard is a groundwater only model. The base would be just a saturated flow model with very little representation of the surface, right? It's treated as simply some sort of boundary condition. The reason behind this is oftentimes this is quite deep. Perhaps the idea of the interaction between the surface and the subsurface is a little unclear because it is so disconnected. And on top of that, we also have just the idea that it was much more complicated to integrate these two. So the motivation behind this work was to take a look at how we represent the surface interactions in these types of dewatering models and what kind of impact it's going to have on the model development itself and also on the estimates of dewatering that we're getting. So the research approach that we took for this, and whenever I say we, it's predominantly Adam that I'm talking about here, is first we started out with, again, that sort of base level model. So we used standard commercial software, so in this case, starting out with FeedFlow, and calibrated a steady state saturated groundwater flow model. Stepping from that, Adam then duplicated that model, so not recalibrating, just duplicating everything from the FeedFlow model into HydroGeoSphere. And the purpose behind this was really to ensure that when we move forward with the sort of different implementations of the surface, that we have a model that is representative of what that sort of industry standard would have been. The next step was to move a little closer to the surface, right? So now we're including the vadose zone. We've got unsaturated flow coming into that scenario. And then the next step was then to employ the fully integrated surface subsurface. And what I'll note and what I'll point out a bunch of different times here is you'll notice that it says calibrate on the first point and the rest it does not. We did not further calibrate the model to try to improve the fit. We simply built on top of that calibrated model with, as you'll see in the future, sort of standard literature values and those that were available for the site that we chose. The final step with this model was then to estimate dewatering under historic and future climate scenarios. So taking a look at the study site that Adam used for this. So this is a mine site in the Northern Quebec region of central Quebec. As you can see here, this is an area where there probably is some surface interaction. We can see several large lakes in the region. We have site A in the middle here, one of the mine sites, and site B. You also see we have some significant variations in our topography, sort of typical of those Laurentian Mountain type of environment. If we take a look at the subsurface, it's sort of your typical complex geology that we're going to see up in those regions in Quebec. So we do have complex topography in that we do have some of the bedrock being exposed at the surface due to deformation. We do have a variety or areas of discontinuous till from the glacial movement at this place as well. And what we really found, or what Adam really found, is that when we're thinking about groundwater flow in this area, we can treat the matrix predominantly as one solid mass or one solid continuous type of rock. Because what the flow is being dominated by is the series of fractures and shears and actual inner workings that are already present from previous mining operations in this area. So that was the way that we chose, rather than trying to represent all of the different units within this. We simplified that a bit, and you'll see that in our model development. So speaking a little bit more about the anthropogenic changes to the subsurface that are already there. So there are already existing mine workings, existing galleries at both the site A and site B. Site A is much shallower, going down to about 700 meters below the ground surface. Site B is almost to 1.5 kilometers. They have found ore bodies located fairly close to the surface, specifically at site A, as close to about 160 meters below ground surface. So this sort of gives us an idea of the depth at which they may want to dewater into the future. Also on this image, you're going to see these sort of fractures that are present lightly here. You can see they're fairly extensive. At least this is their superficial projections. So when we take this type of environment and we try to build that model out of it, so first off, we have to think about how we're going to characterize the subsurface. And as I said before, the decision was made to sort of broadly capture those bedrock as one sort of continuous unit, as opposed to trying to figure out all those variations. It was split up into a shallow bedrock and a deeper bedrock, mostly trying to capture the variations due to pressure, right, getting sort of that tighter hydraulic conductivity with depth. And we also have a layer of overburden at the surface. Those discrete fracture networks, from what Adam could see through the reports, he also went and visited this site. We took the information that was available about their sort of surface projections with respect to their strike and their dip, and projected that with depth. That's the best information that we had. And this is a good time to point out that in the developing of the model for this site, the purpose of that was not to necessarily inform their dewatering efforts. This isn't something that they're using for an application for dewatering. The purpose of this was to try to build a model that was fairly representative of a site typical like this, and then see how these different surface projections might change the results. So yes, the fracture networks here are probably not perfect. We don't understand their connectivity, their depths, and all of their variations, but we're capturing something that is fairly representative. Going along with that, you'll take a look at this map. You can see the red outlines are sort of the watersheds for each of those larger water bodies that are present around these mine workings. We didn't have the ability, it was going to be very difficult to try to simulate a basin of this size, given the limited information we have. And so this green area is actually our model domain. And so we had to bring in boundary conditions that kind of informed how the water moved around that. So the lateral flow of movement, the movement of the groundwater in and out of our domain, was really based off of an understanding of the regional groundwater flow and some limited hydraulic head measurements that were present around. Most importantly, again, right now we're talking about that saturated groundwater model, is how we represent the interaction with the surface. In this case, that interaction is really represented in that recharge boundary condition. So for this case, what Adam did is he collected the precipitation measurements historically from the area. He used ET estimation to remove that. And that was mostly done just out of computational ease and also not having the information needed to run the ET module within HydroGeoSphere later on. So we wanted to find a way to try to do that in the saturated flow model that could be consistent into the future so that ET isn't what varies. So we have our historic precipitation. We've reduced that by our evapotranspiration, and he also used runoff coefficients to estimate the runoff. So the remainder of that is what we anticipated or what we included as a recharge boundary coming in from the surface. Now, again, taking a look at the sort of anthropogenic part that's in there, the location of the existing galleries was something that Adam got information about, so was able to bring that into the modeling domain and represent that. In addition, when we're thinking about dewatering, again, going back to this isn't supporting an application for dewatering efforts. If that was the case, you'd want to optimize the location of your pumping wells, of your pumps, their capacity. And in this case, we were just looking at one example. So for the dewatering parts here, we're locating one pump, sort of the central point of those galleries, so about 400 to 500 meters at site A, 700 to 800 meters below ground surface at site B. And they were simply treated as this sort of maximum flow constraint boundary, which essentially just means if water comes into that area, it's going to be extracted, right? And keeping track of that gives us an idea of how much water we have to remove in order to make sure that we're dewatering all of the galleries. Okay, so then that is the one that we calibrated, right? So this is our saturated flow model. That's very briefly how we parameterized it. And now we're going to calibrate it. This is the one time we're calibrating. This was a little bit of a challenge. As you can see here, we do have several boreholes in the area. We do have a lot of hydraulic head measurements. The problem was the uncertainty associated with those was fairly high. They weren't all taken at the same time. A lot of the boreholes, we don't have information necessarily on their installation with respect to if they're vertical. A lot of them were not vertical and had some sort of angle to them. We don't know what that angle is. So the actual location and depth of those measurements was a little bit up in the air. So because of this, Adam elected to go for sort of a manual calibration approach as opposed to something that was automated. And that's because sort of expert judgment and bringing in other qualitative information about the site was needed to sort of figure out what is the most representative conditions at this site. So that is how we built and calibrated that saturated flow model. And again, that was done using fee flow. It was then translated over directly into HydroGeoSphere. The next step was then extending that HydroGeoSphere model to include the unsaturated zone. And again, this is not where we do another further calibration. What was done here is literature values for the Van Gunungton parameters were brought in, and that was it. So we included those upper layers, included that in the domain, and applied the Van Gunungton parameters. The next step was then applying the surface domain, right? So that's our last step in this. And in this case, again, we're bringing in some more information, but not doing further calibration. So we had to delineate the different surface types. We have the disturbed areas, such as at the mine sites. We have light vegetation, thinking scrub, stuff like that. And then we also have the denser forest. The last surface type is, of course, open water bodies, because we have a lot of them in this area. We use literature values for those parameters. You're thinking things like your surface friction coefficient, rail storage, et cetera. And in this case, and this is a little bit different from how HydroGeoSphere is typically used for representing the surface, the lakes in this case, these surface water bodies were represented as constant head boundary conditions. The reason for that is because we had to shrink that domain size to include not the entire watershed. As such, and we also don't have information necessarily about the inflows and the outflows along the boundaries of these surface water bodies. So it wasn't really possible for us to have the model recreate those water levels. So we simply held them at a constant value that was consistent with measured or observed water levels in the field. And again, all of this was put into place, but no further calibration was done. This is just additional information applied on top of that calibrated saturated model. So now let's just quickly review the types of models that you're going to see results for, because I know that was a lot to sort of go through. So we talk about our base case, and that's where we'll start. This is where there's no dewatering. So this is what we calibrated to. This is what we had hydraulic head measurements for. We have two steady state saturated models, fee flow that was calibrated, and then HGS that was mimicking that fee flow model. We have the transient unsaturated model in HGS, and then we have the fully coupled one. Once those were developed, then these dewatering simulations were conducted. Again, they're conducted in the steady state saturated models, both for fee flow and HGS, again, just to sort of make sure that those are consistent with each other. And then we skipped right to the fully integrated model. So we looked at the transient one with historic effective precipitation, and then we looked at one with a projected future climate scenario. And that idea there was to see, okay, how would the potential dewatering change in the future if we used this type of modeling approach? So first off, let's take a look and see how those two models compare. So the two saturated groundwater flow models between fee flow and HGS. So you can see the fee flow model and HGS, we're comparing them here, just looking at sort of the fluxes that we're getting out of those simulations, and they match pretty well. Like this gave us confidence that we were consistently simulating between the two the same type of scenario. The next step from there was to see how things would change when we included that transient, the transient unsaturated and the fully coupled simulations. And so we take a look at that, we can see how our R-squared values here compared against observed. So we'll notice the fee flow value, we had about an R-squared of 0.59 using fee flow. We know that we have a fairly consistent model with that saturated version of HGS, so the one in red triangles. So the R-squared went down a little bit to 0.57, but again, was consistent with the fee flow model. When we increased or when we included that unsaturated zone, we see our R-squared value go up marginally to about 0.62. But what was really interesting is when we included the surface, our R-squared went up to 0.95. And I will say that this is something that I think Adam checked many, many times over to make sure that this was actually the value that came out, because we were quite surprised with how good of a match came out of that. And you'll notice here that the black squares, which are that fully integrated HGS model, does a really good job at matching, even being along this 1-to-1 line for most of the simulations. It's a little off here where we have these higher hydraulic heads, but it's definitely a better match than the other ones. So I've said it a few times already, I'll say it again. This is done without additional calibration. This is calibrating that saturated flow model and then using available literature values and site information for the rest of it. So this is something that we were excited to see and really sort of speaks to the type of information and the type of better calibrated fit we can get when we do include the complexities that come in at the surface. So let's take a look now at the results of our dewatering simulations. So the main difference here, and what I'm highlighting first off, is the impact of those lakes, right? So in the saturated model, we can take a look to see what's happening below those lakes, how they're interacting with the groundwater flow model. And we see for those lakes, for Lac de Ré and Lac Chibougamau, we see that in all cases, they are something where they're a source of water to the subsurface. But Lac de Ré actually flipped between our saturated flow model and our fully integrated system from being a sink to a source. The other thing that hopefully you've noted here is the order of magnitude of water source between these two is huge, right? It had went up by 6 orders of magnitude in most cases between our saturated flow model, where we just kind of estimated a recharge value and had that flow through, versus where we have it fully integrated and we have those represented still as constant heads, but we have it directly in contact with that unsaturated zone and with those fracture networks. We'll think here, well, there's a whole lot more water coming in. Where's it all going? How is it changing things? I also want to point out the fact that we can represent surface outflow using HydroGeoSphere. That's something that's simulated, right? We have critical boundary conditions, critical flow boundary conditions around the edge where we don't have surface water bodies. And what we're seeing here is a lot of water is leaving through that. So a lot of the water that's coming in is actually leaving along the surface and not necessarily coming in. So that's where we have this sort of change in balance. So what impact does this have on our dewatering? And I will say our expectation was that the dewatering values were going to go up significantly and that you were going to underrepresent what you're potentially needed for dewatering if you weren't including this proper surface representation. But as you can kind of see, that didn't necessarily happen. So first off, the importance of topography here and representing that surface is critical. But then also when we take a look at that dewatering efforts, those values are fairly consistent between them. And that's likely because we have the surface outflow, right? So we see that these large reservoirs are essentially connected directly through our fracture network in this area to our subsurface basin. But despite that being a predominant source, our dewatering values didn't go up significantly. They went up a little bit, but not as much as we were anticipating. So while this was a surprise and maybe wasn't the drastic result that we were hoping to see, what it does indicate is that this improves our understanding of where that water is coming from as it enters the galleries, right? This is giving us some information about what is going to impact those changes in dewatering. So in this case, we're very much concerned about how much water is coming in through the lakes, how connected that would be to the galleries themselves, and less about sort of what's happening in those upland areas and the recharge coming through there. So this was actually tested a little bit further. So this is with historic precipitation. Adam also took a look at one climate projection as well. So looking at sort of one of the more extreme climate projections, the RCP 8.5. And here for this region, he found that it's expected that our precipitation is actually going to decrease with time. And so as a result, he went in and simulated the same thing, this mimicked that historic simulation, but with a decrease in our effective precipitation, basically showing a decrease in that water coming in through recharge. So you'd think that if you're decreasing the amount of water coming into the basin, right, decreasing that effective precipitation, that likely the next step is that you would probably have to decrease your dewatering. However, what we found is not that case. And again, that goes back to the information that we're getting from that fully coupled model with the importance of these large water bodies and how that's bringing a lot of that water in. Even if we have, you see here, our effective precipitation has been cut by almost half. We don't see anywhere close to that reduction in our dewatering. The reason for this is because the largest source of water coming in is really these lakes. And in fact, we see that that middle lake actually has an increase in water coming in the future climate scenarios. And so this is what's driving that system. So if we're thinking about projecting dewatering efforts in an area like this, it's less about paying attention to the actual precipitation falling and more considering the effects of what the surface water bodies are going to do. We did not capture a change in surface water level as a result of the change in precipitation that is likely to occur, but that would be the next step. If you see a decrease in those lake levels, perhaps then you would see a slight decrease in the dewatering, but it's not the precipitation that's driving these dewatering efforts in these simulations. It's the connection between those large water bodies with the subsurface galleries. So sort of wrap it up, the main takeaways that I have here is that our surface representation does matter. And I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. This isn't something that's a thought, but we definitely saw a drastic increase in our calibration metrics when we included the surface. And again, this was not done through another hefty calibration procedure. It was taking available data, literature values, and just including the surface. We also found that it's probably important for estimating dewatering, but it maybe isn't as important as we thought it was, or rather it's not important necessarily to the quantity, but to understand the mechanism for which water gets into those galleries themselves. So in this case, understanding the connections between these large surface water bodies and the galleries through these potential fault systems is probably what is going to drive those dewatering values and is something that the owners of this property probably need to pay more attention to or get more information on as they plan dewatering efforts. So with that, I will say thank you all for paying attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have and possibly direct them to Adam.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I haven't seen any questions come in to the chat during the presentation, but of course, yeah, we're happy to stay here for a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I would be happy to unmute people as needed as well. Here's one question from Jimmy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Andrea, and for the work, Adam. I was just wondering what sort of error and performance metrics you guys were looking at with your models, just as you were running and calibrating them to make sure, or to check in on your water balances.
So my recollection, so R squared was the main one we were looking at. We knew that there was, based off the data that we had and the hydraulic head measurements we had available to actually calibrate it, that to have something really rigorous for calibration was not necessarily reasonable. There was so much uncertainty involved. As I had said, Adam had actually went out and visited this site with Bluemetric, chatted with the folks who've been working there for a really long time, and got a bit of an understanding of how the flow system probably sort of occurs on top of those available data. So we did use R squared. There was a check to ensure that the fluid mass balance error was I say acceptably small, and in all cases it was quite small. I think we do have that reported in those previous slides, but that was really about it. Again, the main effort here was to see how that changes in surface are going to change the results, and less about getting like an accurate model of this site.
Great, thanks. And what, just out of curiosity, do you remember what your model runtimes were like?
That would be an excellent question for Adam. And I think not short, but not obscenely long. I'm sure I can come back to you with a better answer on that. It wasn't running on any super computer. I have a local server here with, I think, 16 processors on it, and it was on there. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer for you.
No. Thanks very much.
I can speak to it a little bit. First of all, thanks, Andrea. Phenomenal presentation of the material. I just want to say that while I'm off mute. And yeah, the model runtimes for the saturated model, where as far as I can remember, and it's a while ago now, they were in the neighborhood of 30 minutes. It did have a tendency to run fairly long, I think, just because of the sheer amount of prescribed discrete fracture features in that model, which can obviously add a lot of processing overhead. And then, although it's a simple domain, it is a relatively large and deep domain. I think we simulate down to about 2.5 kilometers. And then when the unsaturated zone and the surface component are layered on top of that, you start to move into, I think it was several hours, but certainly not more than 12 hours worth of simulation time for that run.
Great, and that's the 50-year transient?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
I see another raised hand here, Ed Siddiqui. Ed, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, Andrea. Nice talk.
Thanks, Ed.
Quick question. Since most of the water that's in the galleries come from the lake, were there any samples taken of the water being pumped for an isotopic analysis to see that there is a strong connection?
That would be a good next step. So right now, these galleries aren't being actively mined, is my understanding. So the work done here was sort of in preparation for potential future development beyond what was already done. So that would be an excellent next step if they haven't already. That wasn't something that we really focused on. But yeah, that would be it. If they continued to develop this work, and I did speak with some BlueMetric folks at Ottawa, at IH, GACMAC, and they indicated that this work may come back online, that would be a very good suggestion, is to just confirm that connection, because your isotopes should be reflecting a much shorter flow path from the surface to the subsurface than if it was attempting to go through the matrix.
And one other minor question. The reason for including fee flow, was that because it was an existing model already developed?
That was sort of at the request of the client. So the property owner, I think it's what they conventionally had been using. And so they did want to see, excuse me, that those two would be reflected. So that was more of a trust exercise to demonstrate that the model that we're moving forward with this fully integrated approach was reflecting exactly what they would have gotten out of a fee flow, which is what sort of their industry standard was considered to be. Okay,
good. Thanks.
I'll at least take this moment to thank you again, Andrea. Great presentation. Really glad that you were able to make the time and give this presentation to the Aquanty network. If anybody out there is interested in learning more about HydroGeoSphere, again, feel free to reach out to us at Aquanty anytime. If there are no other questions, I guess we'll end the webinar here. Thanks again, Andrea.